Pakistan and made their ways to the United States. One of them's now a lawyer, another one's a psychologist at the University of Maryland, another one is a doctor. And I thought about them and about how far, how far a backlash might go towards them. And so far, we don't have the institutional response that we had in 1942. But things are pretty frightening for some of them. A Sikh man was murdered in the days immediately after the attacks in Arizona, and another in Texas. Mosques have been attacked. Those kinds of things have happened. But they've been random acts, not institutional acts where hundreds of thousands of people have been affected. So I've been asked by my colleagues and some of my students, have we learned our lessons? Yeah, I think so. I don't think every person has learned their lesson, because the acts that we see today are individualized, not institutionalized. So I think in the main we have, and that's a legacy of those people that were just on the screen. But it wasn't just the Japanese that were dehumanized in this way. Here you see the Italians being dehumanized, and the Germans as well, and of course Tojo, so Mussolini, Hitler, and Tojo, and being dehumanized with humor. Set them on their axis. Let's go, everybody. Keep them firing. And these kinds of images, and you'll see this too, I'll show you a few more that are humorous, trying to use humor to help people. And this is a defense production poster, Keep them firing, and be planted, posted in a defense plant, that are trying to defuse the tension of the situation using humor. And you'd see that again and again and again. Okay, another kind of poster dealing with production would equate for you war production with fighting on the front lines. Here you see a scene in this poster, battle stations, keep them fighting, where a number of naval men are manning an anti-aircraft gun. And down here below, you see the worker in the factory, an older gentleman, who's working a lathe and turning that exact same anti-aircraft gun. And making that equation, that his job and his work on a daily basis was just as important as these men's work. That equation had to be met if Americans were going to be convinced to work at the levels that they have to meet full production, to be able to produce not only for our own troops in our own country, but for the troops and the people in countries all around the world. And so you'd see scenes like this one. Well, this is from early in the war. Let's give him enough and on time. I think you can recognize what the artist is trying to convey here. It's a soldier dug into his foxhole. His clothes are ripped and tattered. He's hungry. He's dirty, cold, and his machine gun is just running out of ammunition. And so this poster, hanging on the wall in a war production plant, would remind you that he's only as capable as a fighter as he is armed. And he's only armed if you stay on the job. If you work an extra shift this week, or an extra 2 hours today, or if you make sure that you're keeping yourself healthy, that you get your flu vaccine this year, that you keep yourself well fed, and you don't get sick, and you don't take off from work for being ill. Those kinds of things are important, and they're just as important as fighting on the front lines. And that's the information that the OWI and all of the Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce were trying to get out in these posters. And by 1944, you see the same call, but the form has changed dramatically. 42, artistic, symbolic, emotional, putting you in the foxhole with this guy. By 1944, the ad men from Madison Avenue have taken over, and they're telling you what to think and believe in cartoon-like fashion. They show a soldier's face here, but all the rest of the imagery behind looks like it might have come out of a comic book. And it tells you exactly what to believe and what to think. A good soldier sticks to his post, and that includes soldiers of production. This was a huge series, a Soldiers of Production series, hundreds of posters in this series alone in late 43, 44, and 1945. leaving very little to the imagination, very little in the way of emotionally drawing symbolism, telling you exactly what you needed to know and what you needed to do. And of course, they were not only targeting men, older men, younger men, for this work, but women as well. You can't take 18 million men out of a population of just over 100 million out of the workforce and then ask the country to multiply its gross national product by 10 or 12 times without filling the gap somehow or another. And so during the course of the war, thanks to information like this, showing you soldiers without guns and what they could do for the war effort, you wouldn't have 6 million American women who for the first time during the 1940s would go out of the home to work. That's the number of women, 6 million who had not worked in the 30s or the 20s, who were adults, who had not worked before, who would leave the home for the first time to work outside the home. 6 million. And they're adding to a population of more than about 10 or 11 million women who are already out working, trying to fill the gap in the production lines when all the men go off to fight. And here you see this poster is giving you an idea of what kinds of things you can do. And the answer is just about anything. Any work a man can do, a woman can do, the Office for War Information is telling you through this image. You can do factory work, assembly line work, heavy industry, in terms of this woman here who's wearing a welder's mask, light industry, heavy industry, clerical work, bookkeeping, typing, receptionists, things like that, especially this woman wearing the white blouse and the black jacket there of the government worker. All of these women in all of these capacities are fighting in a productive capacity and are fighting here on the home front and home. And that was an idea that the federal government had to sell families on to allow wives and mothers to move outside the home to work for the war effort. It was a tremendous campaign. And you would see them in all of these industries. And this is probably the most beloved of these images, and the one that's most known, most widely distributed. You all know who this is, right? Sure, Rosie the Riveter. And people know who she is today. Why? I mean, how do I know this? Well, geez, the image is still ever present. If you go to the National Museum of American History or the Smithsonian and you wander into their gift shop, boy, this sucker's everywhere. You can buy it on a poster. You can buy it on a t-shirt, a sweatshirt. You can get a computer screensaver and a mouse pad with this image on it. And you can get aprons and oven mitts and pot holders with this image on it as well. Think about that one for a minute, right? Kind of defeats the idea of the whole image. We can do it, right? But not only in those places. Last year on my college campus, one of the women's organizations was sponsoring a series of programs for Women's History Month. And as the cover to their program, they had a number of speakers, workshops, and all kinds of things. And as the cover to their program, they chose this image and put on the front. So it makes sense to people still in the year 2001. Another story, just to again show you how ever-present this image is. 2 years ago in March, I went to Erie, Pennsylvania. I had been invited by a chapter of the National Organization for Women to come up for Women's History Month and deliver a lecture on women's history, which I did. And when I got there, I was invited to the now president's home for dinner before. And so I arrived for the dinner, and I walked in, and she introduced me to her husband, who was in the kitchen cooking dinner. How do you like that, right? And he was wearing one of these aprons with the We Can Do It thing, right on the apron, which I thought was hysterical, right? So she's got this in her own kitchen and makes her husband wear it while he cooks her dinner. Sorry. Anyway, too much irony. So it's a very current still image that still means something to people today. And it's so current, means something to people, so much so that you ask anybody anywhere in this country who this is, and they all immediately know, oh, that's Rosie the Riveter. Right? Wrong. That's Rosie the Riveter. Who knows who this woman is? The answer is, well, who is it? No, it's not. That's Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter was Rose Lindemann, a woman who was painted by Norman Rockwell in 1943 for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, May 26, 1943. How do we know it's Rosie? Well, it says so in her box, but that's Rose Lindemann. She was a welder and a riveter, first as a welder and then later a riveter, in West Lafayette, Indiana. Working in for a defense contract for the Navy. And here's the real Rose Lindemann. And this appeared on May 26, 1943, and quickly became the best-selling copy of the Saturday Evening Post for the entire World War II era. The best of Rockwell's sellers. Incredible. And this is why the federal government, 2 months later, commissioned that image. It's a response to the real Rose Lindemann. And let's look at Rose, the Rose that Americans saw on the Saturday Evening Post on May 26, 1943. One of them being my mother. My mother tells a story about the Saturday Evening Post and is loving that magazine. And when it would come, she loved the pictures, the covers, and the stories, and what have you. She remembers running home from school on the day that she knew of the week that it would be delivered to get a look at it, right, before her father got home from work or what have you. And she remembers that this one came out, coming at home from the end of school and seeing this image on the cover of the Post, or the Saturday Evening Post, and all of a sudden realizing that she had a hero in this war, and that her hero was Rosie the Riveter, this woman. But think about how patriotic she is, and what she's doing for the war effort. My mother was 10 years old at this time, and her little brother, could look up to, many of the men, some of them in our family, like their Uncle Preston, who was off fighting, and had a hero in their uncle. But she didn't have a hero at this point until Rosie the Riveter. And you look at the image, and it is extremely patriotic. Here she is, perched upon a stool in front of an American flag, looking extremely proud of herself and her job. And why shouldn't she be? She's working for defense production. But look what's happened to Rosie Lindemann. She's working here with this riveting gun every day, and it's led to a tremendous amount of muscular development in her arms, her forearms, her biceps, her triceps, her shoulders. And here she's proudly displaying these guns of her own by rolling up her sleeves. And that display in front of the American flag is a source of her pride. It's a badge of her patriotism. She has transmogrified herself almost into the form and the shape of a man out of her patriotic duty to serve her country in any way she could, and in this way, producing for the war effort. And how is she thanked for that? I'm sorry? By this image that comes to whitewash her 2 months later. Let's just go back again. So, I'm sorry, continue to go in the wrong direction. So, her arms, you see. But there's more to it than that was threatening to the federal government. You see that she's sitting here on this stool, and she has her legs crossed, not ladylike at the knee, but like a man at the ankle, with her knees drawn open, with the riveting gun laid rather suggestively across her lap, with her arms folded like a man, eating a man-sized sandwich, and wearing a uniform with, see these little buttons she's got on here? Well, this one might be for a blood drive, and that one might be for a bond drive, and this might be a save scrap button. But they're badges of honor to her that she wears across her chest as she works. She's wearing what she conceives to be a military uniform. And as she's sitting there eating her lunch, this is something that most people miss about this image that I love. It's my favorite part. She has her feet perched atop a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. She's a man, right? That's what the federal government is worried that Americans will perceive. They're terrified that American men, husbands, fathers, boyfriends, won't allow their wives and daughters or mothers to go outside the home to work in heavy industry because it might turn them into men. And so, to answer this image, the Office for War Information commissions this poster to be drawn, okay? Which carries some of the same ideas. We can do it. Women are necessary in the war effort, but it whitewashes their participation. Propaganda. Look what they've done to Rosie's face, right? All of a sudden, she's got mascara and eyeliner. Her eyebrows have been tweezed. You look at her, she's got foundation and rouge and lipstick, all of this stuff. And she's going to go to work in a factory looking this way, right? And look at her fingernails, as someone pointed out to me in the afternoon. My goodness. And her hands are dainty. And then look at her arm. Yes, she's making a muscle, showing you that she can do it. But where's the muscle? It's not there, boys. She's all woman still, right? Trying to convince American men here that allowing their wives outside the home, wouldn't turn them into men. But of course, for Rose Lindemann, she wasn't a man. She was a woman. And these characteristics were her badge of patriotism. And of course, that's all denied by the federal government with campaigns like this one. In addition to the We Can Do It poster, in the fall of 1943, the Office for War Information used its power to put a multi-page spread into various magazines, men's and women's magazines, Life magazine, Look magazine, and others, that dealt with the issue of women working outside the home and whether or not you should be afraid. And so what they did is they shot staged photographs like this one. Here you see a woman that's lifting the veil of her welding mask, revealing the full complement of makeup, lipstick, eyeliner, mascara, eyebrows, the whole 9 yards, right? Foundation, rouge, all that stuff. See, underneath the mask, it's just a woman, right? And she's still very feminine. Please. How in the world could you work in a real situation like this and look like that? Of course you can't. This is a picture of a woman working in an iron foundry in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where temperatures rise to 160, 170 degrees. If you were wearing all of that makeup, it would look like some kind of horrible scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark with the women's faces melting up. Of course they don't look like that. It's propaganda, right? So that's the real Rosie the Riveter. Women who, performed in heavy industry and light industry and in the service sector out of patriotic duty. And let me show you another picture of a real Rosie the Riveter. Here's one that you don't normally see. The Second World War, remember I mentioned a few minutes ago about the executive order that created the Fair Employment Practices Commission that was signed just days before the executive order that called for. Well, anyway, prior to the Second World War, if you had the double cross to bear in this country of being black and a woman, you were likely only able to support your family and earn an income by taking care of other people's children, cleaning other people's homes, or washing other people's laundry. And that was pretty much it. But the incredible need for production during World War II outstripped the supply of labor to the point that there was a necessity for anyone who is able and willing to work. Even women, even black women. And so for the first time, people in varying reasons, not just them, I could show you pictures too of Latinos who for the first time had jobs in industry making decent wages, were able to go out to work. And it's an undertold story, but this scene shows an integrated workplace, and the FEPC mandated, and the federal government mandated that if you were going to have a defense contract, that you must comply with the FEPC and have an integrated workplace. And as you see, this is one. So women had to be targeted. So too did people, average working people, who were part of the workforce for a long time before the Second World War. And here I'm talking about labor unions. It had only been, by the time the war broke out in 1941, it had only been 6 years by that time in this country that you legally enjoyed a right to join a labor union. Just 6 years. But here you see a poster with a quote by Franklin Roosevelt, and you'll see this again and again and again too, using the person and the words and the images of FDR to sell various things throughout the war. Well, here you see a quote from Franklin Roosevelt from the 1936 presidential campaign, which was, "If I went to work in a factory, the first thing I'd do would be to join a union." And during the war, this image was brought back again because labor unions during the war were offering no strike pledges and were offering to rescind demands that they had made prior to the war and that had been guaranteed by the National Labor Relations Board to limit their number of hours and demands about working conditions and those sorts of things, and began to patriotically offer more to produce more for the war effort. And so the government understood that a union was just as good, if not better, at controlling its workers than the government could be. So, use this kind of a program to herd people into these unions that had the ties to the AFL and CIO, that had the guaranteed pledges that had already been made to the federal government to work for full production during the time of the war. And then unions, for their part, used the war themselves to gain and bring more legitimacy to themselves. Here you see the American Federation for Labor calling for people to give for home front, for war front, and they created the National War Front, War Fund, and cloaked themselves in the American flag during the course of the war, as did the Congress for Industrial Organizations by creating their own war community fund. And so propaganda is something or information is manipulated in terms of propaganda by governments, but it's also by individual groups, like labor unions, or by corporations. Here you see a poster that has come from the Oldsmobile division of General Motors, along the same theme. Together we can do it. The blue collar of labor, the white collar of management. Together, rather than separate, we can keep them firing. Come use the National Labor Relations Board. Unions are being urged to, and so are corporations, to settle your disputes before they end up in work stoppages or strikes or any of those sorts of disruptions. Use the federal government to arbitrate and work together. And this is an image that's brought about by Oldsmobile. Why? Well, because Oldsmobile wants to keep producing tanks and planes because they have a guaranteed market for these things. The defense contract that they had tells them that the federal government will produce every single plane or every single tank that they'll crank out in a month. So, of course, it's in their best interest to keep production going and to produce as much as possible. This was a golden age for corporations and large, heavy manufacturers in the United States. Never before and never since do we see a period where heavy industry has a guaranteed market for every single product they produce. So, of course, their interest, too, is to wrap themselves in the red, white, and blue just as much as the unions were, and to argue for these kinds of behavior. Well, another image from the work posters is this one, and we'll see a couple along this lines. The idea that you should, as a worker, give 100% every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Never, ever let up. That your job, remember, is equated with war work. The soldier on the front lines can't take a day off. Neither can you. And so this is a poster from later in the war, 44, I believe, that again shows that the ad men are telling you exactly what's going on in these pictures below. But what you see is an American worker playing cards, smoking a cigarette, taking a break, while his compatriots in a Nazi prisoner of war camp are about to feel the heel of the German, or the butt of the German rifle against the back of their head. That enemy gains in shipyard battle as U.S. worker takes extra day off. Instead of don't give up the ship from Admiral Perry, don't slow up the ship. Stay on the job. Don't take an extra long period of break or take an extra day off. You've got to keep working to bring this to an end. Here's another image along the same lines that uses humor. Hang around, girls, we like it. Showing Hitler, Tojo, and Mussolini hanging out in the ladies' room, rather suggestively right over top of the ladies' toilets. And there these women workers are standing in there having an extra cigarette before going back out to the production floor. Well, this poster would be posted directly in the ladies' room to remind you that every minute you spend in here is one less bullet or one less bomb, or one less motor or whatever it is you're working on, and would be one more minute that the war would go on. And so it was that idea being sold either with humor or with drama. Another message. Shh. He's watching you. Loose lips might sink ships. This whole line of posters that are geared towards American workers as much as they're geared towards service personnel. Right? Loose talk can cost lives. And you see here a young American serviceman sitting next to his girlfriend having a conversation, while sitting on the same park bench with them is Adolf Hitler with his horrible ear deformity, right? Listening and eavesdropping in their conversation. And this is geared not just towards the servicemen who might be, and these posters mostly are pasted around American military posts around the country where men are being mobilized and shipped out. Not just to them, not to talk about their assignments and where they're going, but also to people who are working in war industry here at home. Shh. Don't talk about how many rounds of ammunition your plant is making, or how many planes you plan to deliver, or what kinds of planes are being delivered, or how they're being produced, or any of those kinds of things. This is vital information. It's vitally important, and you have it. And if you talk about it to anyone else, you could compromise the national defense effort. You could lose the war. You could lose the war. And you, individually. What you are doing for defense is so important that simply by talking about it could jeopardize the war effort. Is this necessarily true? Well, no, not for most people. Most people who are working on assembly lines in war defense are doing one repetitive job over and over and over and over and over and over and over again all day long. And they see one tiny piece of a 4,000 stage process in the production of a particular machine, and have no idea and aren't privy to the information of supervisors and management of how many they're producing, or the rate at which they're producing them, or any of those kinds of things. But no matter, the government wanted you to believe that your job was so important, and that the information you had that you might not even think is important was that important. Why? Because they wanted to show up to work tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. This is how important it is that we have to spend thousands of dollars convincing you to be quiet about it. You are important. And that's, I think, most of this poster work is trying to reach people at that individual level. Here's one final one from that vein that I think does it better than any of the others. Because somebody talked. Now, this is an image that was archived. It's a piece of artwork from early in the war. Late 42, early 1943. But when the ad men took over the WBI in the middle of 1943, they shelved this piece for a while because they looked at it. It didn't have this slogan at the bottom. It was just a dog sitting in front of a gold star, head draped over a naval kerchief. And the ad men looked at this and like, oh, geez, this is too artsy. The American people will never figure this thing out. Let's shelve it for a while. Well, by 1943, they were 44. They brought this out and they said, well, we'll use it, but we'll have to tell people what it means. And so they put the slogan across the bottom. Well, because somebody talked. Because somebody talked, this dog, right, a golden retriever, the saddest of all puppy dogs, has to lean his head over the kerchief of his master. Where's his master? Gone. Died in service. The gold star, of course, was an emblem that was sent home to families that lost a husband, a father, or a brother. And this poster displays it hanging on a wall, but no family during the Second World War would ever have hung it on the wall. In fact, they were told by the armed service personnel that would bring it to them, instructed to hang it in their window. Those stars themselves were pieces of propaganda to tell people on your block, on your street, that might walk by your house on their way to catch the bus or the streetcar to go to their work in war defense, that your home had paid the ultimate sacrifice for this war. And if they're irritated about having to get up an extra hour early or stay at work an extra hour in the evening, that was the price that they would have to pay for your son or your husband's service and sacrifice. So this is an image that was at first artsy and symbolic, that was had the slogan added to it. Most Americans didn't need that slogan. They knew exactly what this meant. Well, moving on. So there are posters to get people to join the war effort, posters to get people to work in war industry. A third area are posters asking people to please lend their money to the United States government for use in the war effort. The war would cost the U.S. government about $350 billion between 1941 and 1945. In today's money, that would be like $783 gazillion. I have no idea how much that would be. And I don't think there's anyone in this room who knows. I've heard estimates that it would be likely somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 times the value, if you can conceive of that much money. I can't. And about a third of that, 100 million or 100 billion, was raised from the American people themselves, who voluntarily lent that money to the U.S. government in the form of war bonds. $100 billion between 1941 and 1945. Why did the government need to borrow so much money? Well, because it needed to purchase tanks and airplanes and guns and bullets and weapons and food and all those things. It needed to purchase those things from American corporations and American farmers. Because American corporations...
Attention, please. The library is closing in 30 minutes. Copiers will be turned off in 15 minutes. Please check out all your materials now. If you need to apply for a library card, please do so now at the circulation desk. Thank you.
The government needed to purchase all these things. GM was not giving away tanks. Ford was not giving away B-25s. They were selling them at the end of every month. And they expected to be paid. They expected their contracts to be met. The federal government didn't, of course, have the kind of money to purchase the amounts of material to outfit not only U.S. soldiers, but soldiers who are fighting from other countries and people in other countries that needed to be fed and housed and clothed. And so we borrowed money from ourselves in the war bond campaign. And you'll see that selling war bonds is similar to selling people on the idea that their work was just as important as what a soldier was doing here. What should you do? Attack, attack, attack by buying war bonds, equating the purchase of a bond with war service that soldiers are fighting overseas. Another theme. Again, I told you a few minutes ago and showed you an example of using the words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt to sell the war, to sell the labor for the war. Well, here you see his words being used again by Norman Rockwell in a very famous series of 4 posters to sell war bonds by calling upon his famous 4 Freedoms speech of 1941. In January of 1941, he addressed Congress, asking Congress to vote for Lend-Lease aid for the British and the French and Russians. And he did so by drawing a common cause between us, and at the time we were not part of the alliance, we were a neutral nation at the time, and the 3 allied nations. And he did so by outlining these 4 freedoms that all of the allies proposed to hold in common. And so Rockwell painted these 4 images to go along with the 4 freedoms. Say freedom of speech, buy war bonds. And he painted these images, and this is the first of them. For the OWI, he was contracted to do so in 1942, and he was doing so. And by the time he turned them in, the OWI had shifted from an artistic style to an advertising style. And the OWI, when they got them in the winter of 1943, said no thank you. They turned them down. And Rockwell says, okay, I can make more money selling them to the Saturday Evening Post anyway. And he began selling them in other places, and they were wildly popular. Well, the OWI went back on this, and they purchased these four and began to use them in late 1943. Say freedom of speech. Well, the image he's using here, Rockwell is using, of course, is the image of the American town meeting. And the first of your freedoms is an American, the First Amendment, the right to free speech. And here is an American at a town meeting standing up to voice his political opinion, whether it's popular or not. He has the right to do it. That's what makes him free. And the only way to keep that freedom is by buying war bonds. Another freedom that you have as an American, thanks to the First Amendment, that the only way it will remain your freedom is if you fight by buying war bonds, is your freedom of worship, freedom of religion, to exercise whatever faith you believe in. And this is one of the very few posters that would show faces of color, or at least of other colors other than white, during the Second World War, showing the various ethnicities and races and backgrounds that lead to this multiplicity of religion that exists, the polyglot that exists within the United States, and the fact that it's one of our first freedoms and one that we should hold dear to. Ours to fight for freedom from want. And the image that Rockwell draws upon here, that you all readily identify with, is, well, what day is this? That's Thanksgiving. Immediately. Thanksgiving Day is a symbol, is an American holiday and the American symbol of bounty and plenty and freedom from want. And that's a freedom that people around the world can identify with, not just Americans. But it's one that we have. And that if you continue to buy war bonds, you'll save. Save for whom? Well, for your children. Ours to fight for freedom from fear. And here you see the scene of the parents tucking their children in at night. When I was a child, I remember seeing this image in the post office of Rockville, Maryland. My mother would take me to the post office, running her weekly errands every week. And in the post office, they had the Four Freedoms posters in there. And I remember seeing them as a kid, and this is what I was always gravitating towards, right, because of the little children. And when I was a child, I thought that the freedom from fear that Rockwell was talking about was the children's fear. That if you bought enough war bonds and you won the war, that the little children wouldn't have to be afraid. But then when I became a father, about 7 years ago, all of a sudden it hit me. Hey, wait a minute. Yeah, it's not the children's fear that advertisement is playing to, but the parents' fear. What could be more universal? What better way to reach people where they live and to convince them to buy war bonds and to participate in the war effort than by appealing to them as parents? How many American adults are parents? What's the proportion of them that are? An overwhelming majority. Everyone almost can relate to that image. And people did relate to it, and they bought bonds at an incredible rate. Now, the Treasury Department that was selling these bonds and was marketing the bonds through the poster campaign was also involved in direct marketing or target marketing, targeting specific groups. And we've seen that throughout other war posters, targeting women, trying to bring them into work in war industry. Well, here you see a poster that targets African Americans, telling them that they've got a reason to buy war bonds too by showing them the image of African Americans in uniform like this Tuskegee Airman. Right? That you have people, your own brothers and sisters, and or at least husbands and brothers and fathers who are involved in this war effort, and if you want to bring them home, you'll buy war bonds too. That regardless of color or race or ethnicity or nationality, we all have an interest in this war. Keep us flying. Children were targeted too. Even a little can help now. Buy U.S. stamps and bonds. You could get these stamps for a dime or a quarter and fill up a book, where by the time you got $18.75, you get a $20 or a $25 bond, right? And then you'd save those stamps. So, if you couldn't buy a $25 bond, you could certainly buy a 10-cent stamp with your allowance. Now, couldn't you? Even a little can help now. And my mother tells this story. I remember this. When I was 8 years old, I had been infected with the bug of capitalism. I was at school, and I found out that my best friend had started collecting an allowance. for doing chores around the house. He did dishes, he, cleared the table, walked the dog, all that, and he got money, like $1 a week. What a gig. So I went home from school and I asked my mother, I said, where's my allowance? Right? I've got this coming to me. I'm going to contact the National Labor Relations Board. This is slave labor. I won't stand for it. And she looked at me and she says, well, when I was 8 years old, I didn't get an allowance, but I did get something. She said, when I was 8 years old, my father would pay me, instead of an allowance, he'd pay me in war stamps. And he'd give me dime and quarter war stamps, and I'd fill up these books. And she got out one of her last books that she didn't quite make it and showed me the stamps. It was, I think she had $4 or $5 in it. But she had filled up a number of books, throughout her childhood, and was able to cash those in the 1950s when she was in college. And still tells me the story that she was able to pay for almost an entire year of college at Georgetown University with these war bonds that she ended up cashing in. It was incredible. So children were targeted as well. And children were used to sell these things as well, right? Again, why should you buy war bonds? To prevent this from happening, And this, very similar. Children going to school, carrying an apple for the teacher, carrying your books, wearing a gas mask. Why should you buy war bonds? For them, exactly. And just a note about that image, this is done by the apple in the hand. This poster is put out by the Kroger Grocery Company, a national grocery chain. Now it's mostly in the Midwest. But you notice they prominently display their name in the corner of the poster. So when you walk up to it, you can look down there and say, published in the interest of the war effort by the Kroger Grocery and Baking Company. Now, Kroger took a big hit, as did A&P during the World War II, because people were forced to ration and they couldn't purchase grocery products like they had before. And so what Kroger was banking on is that when the war was over and the rations were lifted, that when you took your dollars to buy groceries from a national chain, that you wouldn't go to A&P, right? You'd come to Kroger because they were flying the red, white, and blue and supporting the war effort, published in the interest of the war effort. Well, we see some of that going on today too, I think. There's a lot of marketing going on right now. This morning, when I was leaving Johnstown, we have a Sears and Roebuck warehouse where they recondition damaged goods and then sell it. And they also repair things for you and what have you. And when I rode by this morning, there was a sign in their marquee that said this: God bless America, warehouse sale today. So there is a certain amount of that that's going on right now, and it's nothing new. Went on during the Second World War as well. Another thing to use to sell bonds, again, the image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this time not just his words, but his mug too. This president, this person, was so incredibly popular during the war that the OWI, the Treasury Department, the Labor Department, they couldn't not use him to sell things because of the power of his charisma and personality. We can, we will, we must buy U.S. war bonds and stamps. My father's father, Roy Newman, used to say that he voted for FDR every time he ran. Of course, he worked for the WPA and the CCC, and he had a reason to vote for FDR. And that he'd still have been voting for him all the way up until 1999 when he passed away, if he could have. And he used to say that, FDR would still be president if he was alive today. Of course, he'd be 130-some-odd years old, but he'd still be president of the United States. And I believe it's true. Unbelievably popular. He was elected 4 times. He got over 500 electoral votes twice. The other 2 times just under in the 400s. Had over 60% of the popular vote every time he ran. It's just incredible. Absolutely incredible. So they used his image to sell the war. They also used sex. Right? Advertisers use sex to sell things. Well, this, I'll have to admit, is not an American war bond poster, but it's a Canadian one, but it serves the same purpose. Here's the Dominion of Canada victory loan. You've got a date with a blonde? No. Not unless you're holding a bond in your hand will you get a date with the blonde. And it's not just the Canadians that have figured this out. The Americans understand it too. Here's an American recruiting poster for the Navy. Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy, or the Naval Reserve, or the Coast Guard, using sex to sell these things. The image here is clear. Young men, if you want what's in the uniform, you have to put on the uniform, right? Just as if the same way with the Canadian Bond poster, if you want the blonde, buy the bond. Yeah, actually, this was a World War I poster that was dragged back out for World War II and was extremely popular in the Second War as well, just as the I Want You for the U.S. Army poster was. Another thing to sell bonds? Santa Claus, right? What wouldn't you buy from Santa Claus? Certainly a bond. This year, give a share in America. Defense bonds and stamps. That's 1941, before we were calling them war bonds because it was before we were in war. But by the time they were being sold, and of course, in December, we were. But this is early on. You see the artistic view of Santa Claus. It's very nice, comforting. Here you see by Christmas 1943. What a change in 2 years. The ad men have taken over. Give war bonds, the present with a future. Boom, boom, right? Right, like that. And instead of an artistic image, it's a very boxy, kind of cartoonish image. But the same idea. Give them for Christmas. And the last genre of posters I'm going to show you deals with conservation of war materials. Like this one with gasoline, showing a soldier's face peering out from behind the poster right into your eyes, asking you, have you really tried to save gas by getting into a car club? Or this one using humor instead, the opposite. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Right, there he is, right next to you. Join a car sharing club today, right now. Both of them asking you to conserve gasoline, oil, rubber, all of those things that are vital to the Allied war effort, to our own army and the armies of and navies of our allies. Don't travel unless your trip helps win the war. Here we come to 1944, again late in the war, telling you exactly what to do. Won't you give my boy a chance to come home? Showing a mother during the Second World War with behind her the blue star that was sent home to families who had a husband or a brother or a son who was fighting overseas, who was alive and fighting, hopefully not to be exchanged for a gold star. Also to be hung prominently in your window for your neighbors to see. Food is a weapon. Don't waste it. Buy wisely, cook carefully, eat it all. And you begin to see not just pictures like this and artwork, but slogans that could be used as catchphrases. Like, eat what you can what you can't. Use it up, wear it out, make do or do without. Right? I mean, catchy little slogans that you could remember, and these were spread not just through posters, but also through trailers in front of movies and things like that. All asking you to conserve food, because food would be a weapon to feed the troops and the peoples of other countries who were fighting in alliance with us. Or this one. We'll have lots to eat this winter, won't we, Mother? Grow your own, can your own. If you can produce your own food, you don't have to rely on the national stockpile. That will be more food that can go to help our allies. And the more help we give to our allies, the more able we'll be to end this war quicker. How can you do it? By growing it yourself. Plant a farm garden now, or a victory garden. By the time the war was over, there were more than 10 million acres of American land that were planted in small victory gardens. Think about that. Incredible. And here's one of them. This is the victory garden in the backyard of 206 Baltimore Road, Rockville, Maryland. And that's my mother working in the victory garden. They did a lot of things. They grew tomatoes and peppers and onions and carrots and things like that. But my mother's job here was to take care of the rabbit hutches, dozens of them. At one point during the war, they had dozens and dozens, scores of rabbits. And so her job every day was come home from school and to feed the rabbits, to water the rabbits, to clean their cages, to take them out, you know, exercise them a bit, all of those things. And then once every couple of weeks, it was also her job. Yeah. And you see, this is oh my goodness, an 11-year-old girl clubbing a poor defenseless rabbit over the head. tying its feet up to a tree, cutting around its legs and pulling its skin off? Sure. Her grandmother was a farm woman, right? She's seen these kinds of things, time in and time out. Whenever she went to visit Nana or Papa George, it was cleaning chickens and all that sort of thing. It was, second nature. And that was my mother's part in the war effort, because what that allowed the family to do was to have fresh meat once every other week without taking from the national supply. But they also took the hide of that animal, the pelt, and turned it in to the United States Army to be used for linings and bomber jackets. Right. So an incredibly patriotic thing that she's doing here, working in her victory garden. A couple of years before, here was my mother and her brother, my crazy Uncle Leon, right, together at Halloween. This is Halloween of 1942. My mother at the time was 9, I believe, or just turning 9. Going to turn 9 in November. And my crazy Uncle Leon would have been about 5. And you see, my mother has dressed up for Halloween in a white flowing gown with garland around her head and with a giant V across her chest. She's a victory girl, Lady Victory or Lady Liberty calling for victory. It was a patriotic costume. What was my crazy Uncle Leon? He was a yellow cat. He didn't quite get into the whole World War II thing at that point. Didn't quite understand. Looked pretty good as a yellow cat anyway. A yellow cat with brown shoes. Anyway, but my mother had internalized the war. It was something important to her, and this was a way to support it. She was 8, going on 9. He was 5. Big difference between the two. But Halloween was a place to show your patriotism, just as this year it was for a lot of children. I'd heard before Halloween that there were going to be huge numbers of children that would come to my door dressed as firemen and police officers and armed service personnel. And I was kind of preparing myself for that. Wow, I wonder how many. I was going to count them and kind of use this for a number and talk about it in a lecture maybe 5 years from now to my students. Oh, yeah, I counted 62 firemen and 28 policemen and 38 Army and 12 Navy and, all that kind of thing. But I sat there on my front porch, and I must have given out about 1,500 pieces of candy. It was the biggest Halloween I can remember in years. And I saw one fireman, a couple of policemen, and a couple of kids that dressed up like Army kids, about what you see every year. And at first, I was really concerned about this. I was thinking, well, gee, where's the patriotic show of support? And then I realized that, you know what? This is the best thing that could have happened. Children on the 31st of October did what children do. They dressed up as things that took them away from the war that's going on right now. They fantasized. They got away from reality. They escaped. They didn't embrace it. And I think that's a good thing. I was worried about my own child. On the 10th of September, he was dead set on being Harry Potter for Halloween because he's read the books and loves the thing, and it's all about escaping and being somebody else, and that's what Halloween's about. And I was worried that on the 11th of September, that, and then afterward, that he'd want to change his mind, but he didn't, and he stuck with it, because children need to be children. I think that's what, perhaps my Uncle Leon understands here that maybe my mother didn't. I don't know. But 2 different approaches to Halloween during the war. And just a few more. Clothing, too, was in short supply. Don't take from the national supply of fabric and textiles. Allow those to be used to make uniforms and clothes for other people in other places. Remember Pearl Harbor by purling harder. Create your own. Scrap drives for everything. Scrap metal, blood, bonds. You can have a drive to collect just about anything. But here you see a scrap metal poster. And one interesting thing about the scrap metal drives, and this is, again, speaks poignantly to propaganda, is that the government understood that it couldn't use all the scrap metal it was calling for. And only about 10% of the scrap metal that was turned in for recycling into planes and guns and other metal products, tanks, only about 10% of it could be used. About 90% would have to be disposed of in some way, shape, or form.
The library is closing in 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll be finishing.
Returned out in 5 minutes. Please check out all your materials now. No items should be checked out after 9 p.m. Thank you for using the Abington Free Library.
So, and the government understood this. And so they would call for these drives, and people would collect massive amounts of scrap, and then about 90% of it would be buried. Every once in a while, you hear news of someone, a developer, digging foundations for basements, and all of a sudden they come across a huge pile of old pots and pans. What are these from? Oh, they're from the Second World War. Why did the government continue to call for scrap drives? Save scrap to beat the Jap? Because it was a way to give individual people something to do, so they felt like they were making a connection with this war and bringing an end to it. And if you were a person who would take part in a scrap drive, perhaps you'd also take part in a bond drive or a blood drive, or you would go to work in war industry, or maybe join the war effort yourself. All of those kinds of things. And finally, these women here are practicing conservation. Any of the women here tonight know what they're doing? It's exactly right. They're painting on their nylons, or painting on their silk stockings. Silk, of course, was rationed during the war, and so companies, cosmetic companies, would market a coloring agent that you could paint on these stockings, and they would sell pencils or pens that you could draw the seam up the back. And that was part of the patriotic duty. And finally, the last image I'll show you is this one. Help bring them back to you. What can you do to end the war? You can do all the things that I've told you about tonight and shown you. You can find time for war work, raise and share food, walk and carry packages, conserve everything you have, and save 10% in war bonds. And if you do all of that, you can make yours a victory home and keep that blue star blue and not worry about it turning into a yellow one. Well, I hope tonight that some of the images I've shown you have conjured up memories from those of you who remember the Second World War, and those of you who don't, who aren't old enough to remember it. I hope it's intrigued you enough to go talk to people who you know who did, and to share these memories if you have them, because I think now more than ever they're becoming more and more important. And even if you think